In the previous lesson, we created a stub persistence layer with a repository class in it. Remember that? Now we need to call the method in that repository class to retrieve a given contract DTO so that we can then in turn grab the data out of that DTO, put it in a real contract, and return it back to the caller, which in this case is the unit test, right? However, I hesitated a moment before I did that. I stopped short of creating a reference from the domain layer to the persistence layer, the repository class. I hesitated to create a reference between the domain layer and the acme.maintenance.persistence. Do you know why I did? Why I stopped short? Well, if we implement the interaction between the layers as I started doing by creating an instance of contract repository from the contract service class, like you see right here, then I've created a hard dependency between these two layers. I'll never be able to use any other persistence layer unless I rewrite the code in this contract service class. So this will limit me in the short term as I try to unit test, and in the long term as I want to change out the persistence layer per the requirements that we support other persistence mechanisms other than just SQL Server. Okay, so another way of looking at this is that my dependencies will go from the domain layer to the persistence layer. Ideally, I want the persistence layer as well as the presentation layer to have their dependencies pointing towards the domain layer. I want everything else to depend on the domain layer, and the domain layer should have its dependencies passed to it. It should not be hard coding its dependencies either towards persistence or presentation. So this is known when you have a dependency passed into it. It's known as dependency inversion, and so we'll use the dependency injection pattern to make that happen. Now, from a practical perspective, we'll want the client of our contract service to tell the contract service what it should be using for persistence. The contract service should define an interface saying, I'm willing to work with any repository class that supports these particular methods. So this will be a three-step process. First, I'm going to create an interface on behalf of contract service, defining the methods that it will need to get its work done. After I've defined that interface, I'm going to implement that interface in the persistence layer. I'll make sure my contract repository conforms to that new interface. Finally, in the unit test, where are you, unit test? Come back here. There you are. In the unit test, I'll create an instance of the stubbed contract repository, and I'll pass it to the contract service through a constructor. All right. So when I finish, my dependencies will be pointing in the right directions, and my contract service will operate the way that I envision it should. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. Three-step process. And let me, I've got a mess going here, so let me clean some things up. Okay. First thing I want to do is I'm going to create a new folder called interfaces. Now, I could put these interfaces in their own project since they'll be shared out and used by multiple projects, but they can just sit in a folder inside my domain layer. That'd be just fine. And so now what I want to do is right-click it and select Add New Item, and I'm going to choose from the code selection an interface. And so I'm going to call this interface iContract Repository. Okay. Now, why do I keep the I in front of it? Some people would argue that you don't need an I, that it kind of smacks of that period of time years ago when people used to use a couple characters prior to a variable name in order to indicate its data type or whatever the case might be. And so modern IDEs like Visual Studio, you can merely hover your mouse cursor over and see that something's that it's an interface or whether it's an abstract class or whatever the case might be. I'm merely doing this by convention. Yes, the Framework Design Guidelines book that I've referenced in the Application Architecture Fundamental series, it talks about this very issue, and yet it still recommends that you use the I by convention. So I'm going to follow what they have to say. So don't get mad at me if that's not what you hear from other places. Okay. So anyway, iContract repository. Again, we're creating an interface. And here what I'm going to do is just define the only method that we really need at this point. Okay. And you can see that we don't have a reference to the namespace. Even though they're in the same project, the namespaces are different because I've added a folder, right? So I've put them each in their own folder. So I want to create a using statement, and again, ReSharper helped me do that with just clicking. I could just type in this line of code if I needed to, okay? So that's the first thing that I need to do. Next, what I want is to go then to the contract service. And what I'm going to do is create, first of all, a private property. And I'll make it read-only so it can't be changed after the constructor. And it'll be of type iContract repository. And its name will be contract repository. And here again, I'll need to create a using statement. So it adds this using statement here so that it can find the iContract repository. And so now whenever I need to get to my instance of contract repository, I'll be able to reference it in the body of this contract service using this private read-only member called _contract repository. The next thing that I'll need to do is I'm going to need to create a custom constructor that will allow the calling class, the class that creates an instance of my contract service, to pass in the repository that this class is supposed to use for all of its repository services. All right. So here what we're going to do is public contract service, and it's going to take an instance of iContract repository called contract repository. Oops. Okay, and we'll just merely set contract repository equals to contract repository there. Great. Okay, I do get an error here, and it says inconsistent accessibility parameter type. iContract repository is less accessible than constructor contract service. All right, so that means I probably need to do something like this, public interface, right? Okay, and that should solve my problem, and it does. Great, okay. All right, so then the next thing that I want to do here is now I don't need to create this instance of my persistence layer. It'll already be created for me, and I should just be able to modify this line of code and add an underscore, because regardless of what the concrete class is that's passed into my constructor, I know that it's going to have a getById method because it will have to adhere to the terms of this interface or this contract. Okay, so at this point I think that's all that I need to do there. Going to the contract repository, now I intentionally created the new interface to match what I've already done here. So the only thing that I should have to do is just say that this inherits from iContract repository, and I undoubtedly am going to have to add a using statement. Great. And I'm going to need to make this public too, I'm betting. So it should be good to go there. Now the last thing that I need to do is I'm going to go to my test project, and what I'm going to need to do is add a reference to my new persistence class or persistence project from my test project. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to need to create a new reference. So let me start up here. Var contract repository equals new contract repository. Okay, and again, ReSharper is going to help me by adding the using statement that I need. This particular using statement right here. Okay, now you can see that there's a little red squiggly line. We're creating a new instance of contract service, but it requires that we pass in a contract repository. Well, that's easy because now we have our new contract repository defined in the line above. So we're passing that into contract service, and now everything else should pretty much stay the same. But the real test here will be once we run all of our unit tests, and you can see it still passes. Awesome. All right, so that's great. It works. We've added in a whole extra a layer to break the dependency between our domain layer and our persistence layer. But again, there's a problem that lurks around the corner. What's the problem with this implementation? What decisions have we made that will limit us going forward? Let's take a look at the unit test that we created. It's passing in a contract ID and it's expecting a contract ID back. But what if we wanted to pass in a different contract ID? Will we get the results that we expect? Well, we'll figure that out in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thank you.